And welcome back to Bengal Bites, a podcast about the Cincinnati Bengals from one fan's real, honest perspective. As always, I'm your host, Derek. This is episode 45. This is the preseason week one preview episode, so to speak. We're not going to really do a preseason preview, but we're going into the first week of the preseason. So football games for the Bengals are going to be kicking off at Paycor Stadium this Saturday. So it's an exciting week coming up on first live football action. We've had lots of training camp practices and reports about how great everyone has been looking, and no one's looking bad, of course. So it's time to put their money where their mouth is, go out there and prove it on the field. So we wanted to get a recap of all the news. Some news is good, some news is bad, and some news around the league. We'll cover a few interesting tidbits that happened. I was thinking about in this offseason, while the Bengals weren't playing, I was taking a break from doing the podcast. What kind of a podcast do fans want? I'm trying to think of what's a good podcast? What are some podcasts about football that I like? And I think the biggest thing that I like out of a podcast is consistency. I mean, lots of other NFL podcasts took break in the off season, but it's the worst kind of podcast is the podcast that doesn't exist, right? The podcast that never gets recorded is not a good podcast at all. So I'm going to try to come back on a consistent, at least weekly basis from here on out through the rest of the season to cover all the news, especially when the games are going on, to cover what's happening in the game, because that's what I'm most interested in. No offense to any other podcasts out there, but some podcasts are just talking about nothing when the important thing is the actual football game. And one of the other shows that I listen to, I guess you could call it a podcast, The Rich Eisen Show, which is on all kinds of different media platforms, but you know Rich Eisen from SportsCenter, from ESPN a long ago, and he's still doing his thing. All those SportsCenter anchors, well, I guess not all of them, but a lot of them are doing their own shows now. And on one of his many shows, Rich Eisen said, there are people who want to be heard and people who want to be right. And I'm not sure if that's one of his originals. I just heard it from him. I'm sure he got it from somewhere else, but I thought it was an interesting quote, especially for somebody who does a show like his or like anybody like mine, I guess. People want to be popular. They want to be the most popular viral streamer or whatever. So they say the most ridiculous, controversial nonsense just to try to get clicks, try to get views, but they don't care about being right, being factually accurate. And I would much rather be on the latter part of, I would much rather be right, try to be accurate, factually correct, than just trying to say something ridiculous that a lot of people would want to hear. So if that's the type of show you're looking for, you're in the right place. That's enough self-indulgence right now. I'll come back with a little bit of one other programming note near the end of this show, but let's get into some of the news that happened around this Bengals team. We mentioned how they had been relatively unscathed so far in training camp in terms of injury. Unfortunately, there was a major injury that happened. Fourth-year defensive end Cam Sample out of Tulane. He's been mostly in a backup role behind Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard, but he did see some important snaps. He is unfortunately out all season with a torn Achilles. They put him on injured reserve. He got carted off last Friday, so that's very unfortunate. Bengals were already having issues with Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard sitting out, more like veteran rest than anything, but they're already a little bit thin at defensive end, so people like Joseph Osai, Miles Murphy, Cedric Johnson, the rookie, and some of those other edge rushers are going to have to step in and carry some of the load, like in practice and in these preseason games. We're going to see a lot of the young edge rushers. So hopefully the Bengals, they're probably going to make a move. I think they actually, in a corresponding move, we could say they made some signings. So they signed another defensive end, Andre Carter, 6'5", 270 out of Indiana. He's a rookie, originally signed with Jacksonville Jaguars, but then got waived in the end of July. So they're going to need some depth there on the edge. They also signed a defensive tackle, Joshua Pryor. He is a second-year player out of Boise State. He played 7 games for the Commanders last year, 1 tackle on special teams. He's 6'4", 280. A couple guys, 6'4", 6'5", 275 roughly. Not a nose tackle, which is going to be a concern. We'll get to that in a second, but they put Cam Sample on injured reserve today with the Achilles. And then also one other roster move that the Bengals made today, waived punter Austin McNamara. He was the punter out of Texas Tech that they signed as a free agent. They also waived Trey Mosley. I'm sure he was a free agent, but I wasn't aware he went to school. Didn't hear much about Trey Mosley in training camp, so I guess that makes sense why he got waived today. He wasn't really making any plays to wow anybody apparently. But Austin McNamara, he was the second punter supposedly on the depth chart, but everybody's been raving about Ryan Rico, the punter they signed recently. He got waived from the Chiefs. I don't think he was a free agent because I don't think he got drafted either. But Ryan Rico, I think it looks like Reckow because it's Rekhow, but apparently Darren Simmons pronounces it Rico. So I don't know how you say this guy's name, but apparently he's been booming kicks. He was out of Utah and he was one of the leaders in distance, but apparently he's been kicking like 75-yard punts in practice. The only thing is apparently he's got a little bit of an issue with consistency. But Brad Robbins, the rookie punter that they had last year, was also inconsistent, and he never had any 75-yard punts. So if we have to, deal with inconsistency, at least like Darren Simmons would put it, at least Ryan Rico's A punts, if you're going to grade them like A through F, like his A punt is a lot better than Brad Robbins' A punt. But we want to know how consistent each one of them is. But it's going to be interesting to see. We'll probably see both of those punters in the preseason game. It would have been interesting if they would have had all three punters on the roster going into the preseason, but they got rid of Austin McNamara. If they needed to, I'm sure they could bring him back. But speaking about that depth on the defensive line, one of the other rookie draft picks, the nose tackle, McKinley Jackson, he was out of Texas A&M, third-round pick. He got carted out of practice Monday, and I hadn't heard any updates so far about what the nature or severity of his injury is. So that was a little bit of a concern because he was on the Bengals' first depth chart, which we'll get to, but he was, I think, the backup nose tackle, or at least third string. Maybe he was competing with J. Tufele. We'll take a look, but definitely one of the guys that they were going to be counting on to take a significant amount of snaps. Hopefully nothing serious. We want to get all these guys, basically get them to the dance, get them to week one without getting injured. Speaking of that, we mentioned Trey Hendrickson, Sam Hubbard, still week to week. No rush in getting them back. They're known commodities. Trent Brown, the offensive tackle that they just signed, he has been cleared for practice. And Trent Brown he gave a kind of an odd interview in the locker room with the reporters because it's not like required, but they asked him like, so what was your injury that was keeping you out of practice? And he was very vague and kind of just said, I'd rather keep that to myself. So just some kind of undisclosed, undetermined injury that caused him to miss the first 2 weeks of training camp. And then basically, I think as soon as training camp ended, because now that they're going into preseason game one, it's kind of like a game week. They're going to try to simulate what it's going to be like to head into the game. So they're out of that initial training camp phase mode when it was like 95 degrees out and they're probably practicing long, hard days in the sun. Trent Brown was like, yeah, you know what? I'm probably going to skip the first 2 weeks since I'm a 10-year veteran. I know how this works. I've been through training camps before. So yeah, he was obviously, hey, I'm not hating on him, but he obviously did not want to take part in training camp. And so they're trying to make this into a controversy about, is he going to be in competition with the rookie, Amarius Mims, for right tackle spot? Like Trent Brown said, he's been in the league for 10 years. He's not really worried about some rookie coming in and taking his spot. I'm sure he's going to be the week one starter. Amarius Mims is very raw, and people were hyping him up after like one day of padded practices, but since then, we haven't been hearing these crazy reviews about Amarius Mims. I'm sure it's going to be Trent Brown week one, but we'll see what the rest of the Bengals depth chart looks like. Initially, it was very senior or veteran focus. So let's do a quick rundown of the initial depth charts. We got Jamar Chase and T. Higgins at wide receiver. On the offensive line, we already know Orlando Brown, Cordell Volson, Ted Karras, Alex Kappa, and they penciled in Trent Brown, right tackle. Drew Sample, tight end, which is interesting. He's the starter over Mike Gesicki. I guess that makes sense. Actually, Drew Sample is making more money this year than Mike Gesicki, so he would be the starter in name. Then, surprisingly, they got Trent Irwin as the third wide receiver, and then obviously Joe Burrow, quarterback, Zach Moss, running back. 11 personnel is their default. And then behind them, a lot of people have been hyping up Andre Iosivas as that third wide receiver. He maybe is looking to start at that slot receiver position. And they have, like I said, they have Trent Irwin there for now, but Trent Irwin and Andre Iosivas will definitely be in competition for the third wide receiver spot. Andre talked about how he worked with his own personal wide receivers coach. Andre and Chase Brown, both the rookies coming into their second year, worked with the receivers coach who worked with Mohamed Sanu, apparently, worked on catching his form and his technique, catching the football. That was the biggest thing that, if you wanted to be critical about Andre Iosivas last year, was too much of a body catcher, letting the ball come in, hit him in the chest, and then he would cradle it with his hands instead of going out and reaching it. Now, he says it's like second nature for him. And that's expected because, like we said, he was a multi-sport athlete in college. He did indoor and outdoor track when he wasn't on the football team. And he was working with the decathlon. So 10 events. So he was practicing all kinds of different athletic sports. On the one hand, that's great because he has superior athleticism. He can basically do anything you want at a high level. But he wasn't focused strictly on football, where a lot of these guys, they were saying, okay, this is my path to a professional career. I'm going to focus 100% since maybe high school on going to the NFL. Andre, now he's finally focusing all his attention on that. And they mentioned how he's bulked up. As Joe Burrow looks a lot bigger, Andre Iosivas apparently gained a lot of weight. Charlie Jones also gained a lot of weight, which he needed because Charlie Jones weighed like 165 pounds, it looked like last year. And you can't play in the NFL like that. So Charlie Jones is supposed to have bulked up. Andre Iosivas not only bulked up, but he apparently kept or even got better at his quickness. Everybody knew because he was a track star, he would have straight line speed, but he's also got the quickness and the burst side to side. He said he did a lot of single leg weightlifting. So a lot of times if you're going to do leg lifts, you would do like two legs, putting the barbell across your back, do a squat, do a deadlift, that type of stuff. He was talking about doing a lot of single leg squats, single leg lunges, stuff like that. So that will be hopefully beneficial for him. And that would be interesting if he took that Tyler Boyd, I don't want to say Tyler Boyd role, but that slot position and took those snaps and was effective in there, because a lot of people think of the slot receiver as being smaller, but you're inside there. There's a lot of big guys inside. So sometimes you want a bigger guy in there. And I could totally see Andre, if he can be reliable catching in traffic and hold on to the ball when there's guys all around him. Because when you're inside, there's linebackers, defensive linemen, nickel cornerbacks, safeties coming all over the place. So you have to be very solid catching the ball. Tyler Boyd, we always talk about how great he was at slot receiver, but last year, he just wasn't that effective for whatever reason, for lots of reasons. Tyler, he dropped some passes when he had the opportunity to. He didn't get a lot of separation from the defenders, whether it was because he lost a step laterally or maybe they just weren't respecting him in terms of his speed in general. But defenders seemed to be all over Tyler Boyd wherever he went last year. And so he didn't have a lot of yards, not a lot of catches. Hopefully get more production. And a lot of that is going to be if Joe Burrow can stay healthy. He's looking bigger. He hasn't had any setbacks so far in training camp. All fingers crossed that Joe Burrow is healthy all the way through the season. The offense should look much better. If we think back to last year, the Bengals, especially starting off the year, had one of the worst offenses in the NFL. They didn't score a first half touchdown until week 5. So they are always talking about have a faster start, no slow starts. Of course, every team is going to say that. Nobody wants to come out and go 0 for 4. Of course, everybody wants to have a fast start. You also got to have a good finish. So we don't want to collapse at the end either, like the Eagles. People's weight are going all over the place. Zach Carter, the defensive end third-round pick from Florida, he last year gained a lot of weight and said he totally remade his body, all that stuff. Now this season, he's like, actually, I gained too much weight last year, lost all the weight. Now he's back to his original weight. So he got up to like 315. He didn't look that big. Zach Carter has never looked especially big and powerful because he always gets blown away. So the weight didn't do him any good last year. So apparently he's slimming down back to like 300 or something like that. We'll see. Zach Carter needs to figure something out because he has not done much of anything since he's been in the league. But it's kind of like Tua, like we mentioned, Tua Tagovailoa, quarterback for the Dolphins. He gained all that weight last year. He was okay, but apparently he felt like he was too slow, so he lost a bunch of weight. Speaking of the Dolphins, might have mentioned last time, Tyreek Hill signed an updated contract extension. I think he was due to make somewhere maybe around $20 million. I have to look it up, but not the top of the wide receiver market, even though he was breaking all kinds of records. I think he had almost 1,800 yards receiving last year, and he even missed a game. So he was looking for a raise in pay. He got that in the form of, you have to take all these numbers with a grain of salt, because you could see it like 4 years, $100 million, 3 years, $90 million. It's really like the only thing that matters are the guarantees. So I think the real guarantees are only the first 2 years of the contract, which he's going to make about $54 million over the next 2 years. So basically $27 million a year for the next 2 seasons, which is pretty close to the top of the wide receiver market. So Tyreek Hill would say that he's getting, more fairly paid than he was maybe going into this season. But that's, again, still, that's going to be like, I can't do the math in my head that quick, like almost 6 times more money than Jamar Chase is going to make this season. So again, if anybody is wondering why Jamar Chase isn't practicing, it's because he's vastly underpaid and he wants a new contract, and no reason to put his Achilles or his ACL or any other parts of his body at risk until he feels like he's fairly compensated. So one other thing around the league, Harrison Butker signed a contract extension with the Chiefs. He's their place kicker. He signed a 4-year, about $25.5 million contract extension to make him highest paid kicker. Evan McPherson, the kicker for the Bengals, still waiting on his contract extension, and he didn't make any big deal out of it. He was like, good for Harrison. I'm happy for him, and we're working on a deal for me, and whenever that gets done, it'll get done. Kind of just, not pressing the issue or making it sound like he'd make any trouble if he didn't get a deal done this year. But the risk is so much less for a kicker of getting injured. Now, if Evan has to get involved in tackles and these kickoffs, that'll be a different story. But for the most part, kickers, if you're going into your contract season, that's not as big of a deal as if, some other type of player like Jamar Chase. But it was kind of funny how Money Mac, they asked him, like, who are some of the league's best kickers? Do they think he's one of the best kickers in the league? He was like, oh, yeah, I think I'm one of them. Harrison Butker. He mentioned how Jake Elliott was one of the best kickers in the league, too, which is kind of weird or coincidence because Jake Elliott was drafted by the Bengals, but then they let him go. Or I think they put him on the practice squad at the end of training camp, and then he got signed by another team off the practice squad, or he didn't make it through waivers. For whatever reason, they decided to keep the veteran Randy Bullock and his twitchy calf muscles, let Jake Elliott go, who's one of the best kickers in the league for the Eagles. I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the last podcast. Hakeem Butler, UFL Offensive Player of the Year, wide receiver, signed as a backup. So we'll see in the preseason what he's able to do. A lot of these guys, they talk him up as far as having a lot of highlights in practice, but there's no referees out there. You got to take everything that they say as far as practice with a grain of salt, because these guys, they could be getting away with penalties that would be called if it were a real game. But since it's not a real game, there's no penalty. And then, this guy made an amazing catch, even though it was, offensive pass interference or some defender made an interception. Oh, it was actually defensive pass interference, but there's no referee out there to call it. So great play by that guy. So you have to take all these reports with a grain of salt. But that's why it'll be interesting to see what happens in the preseason game. Zach Taylor said that the starters are going to play in the preseason. Joe Burrow said he wants to play in the preseason. We'll see how much Joe Burrow and the starters play. I don't anticipate to see T. Higgins or Jamar Chase or any of those type of players out there. Not for game one, maybe in game two. I think last year they had the starting defense play game two for one drive, but mostly they didn't play at all. They had a really long drive against the Falcons. They were not anticipating. It was like a 15-play touchdown drive. They were subbing guys out, or getting tired. So that was a wake-up call for everybody on that first-string defense to step it up. Burrow, it's kind of weird how he was talking about how beneficial the reps in camp are going to be and how everybody's getting better and improving with every rep every day and how important that is to get a feel for each other. But at the same time, he says there's no problem with Jamar Chase not practicing, no big deal. He can jump out there with one or two practices and have no problem jumping back in because Joe understands Jamar's trying to get paid. He can't pull the ladder up behind him. Joe Burrow just got paid last season. Nobody was saying, well, Joe Burrow needs to do this or that about his contract. Joe Burrow understands he's trying to protect his friend Jamar from any type of criticism anyone would have for why he's not practicing. Everybody knows why Jamar isn't practicing. It's a business concern. Just like the same reason a lot of guys around the NFL aren't showing up to training camp. CeeDee Lamb, he's holding out. Brandon Ayuk, he's not practicing. A lot of guys aren't practicing because they're unhappy with their contracts and because of the way that the union and the league and the owners have worked this collective bargaining agreement. Players don't really have a choice. If they hold out, they get fined $50,000 a day. So that's like over $2 million if they held out all of camp. Way too much money for a player to just give up. Like the Patriots, Matthew Judon, that's another story. Just players who are unhappy with their current contracts, they can't not show up. So the team and the player have to kind of work something out. We'll see what these players, all these situations are going to work themselves out differently. Every player is unique, so we can't say if one player gets a deal done, Jamar Chase is going to get a deal done. Eventually he's going to have to play, but it's not really a big deal until he starts missing actual games. We're not there yet, but we saw with the Chiefs last season, Chris Jones, he sat out week one. He sat up in the stands and watched the Chiefs lose week one. And then they were like, yeah, let's get that contract signed. And then they came back and won the Super Bowl. So, he got what he wanted by sitting out. Who knows what could happen? We saw Nick Bosa and the 49ers have a similar situation last year. I anticipate this will go on for a few more weeks. And then we'll probably see Jamar back out at practice if it's just become totally clear that the Bengals aren't going to budge or give him any kind of concessions. I think they should at least give him a little bit. I don't know. There's no way to really alter the contract, and they're going to have him under contract next season. And if they wanted to, they could do the franchise tag on Jamar and have him under contract for another season after this. So 3 more years if they wanted to use the franchise tag. Not even considering a second franchise tag. So the Bengals, if they really wanted to be like hard bargainers about this, they could really stretch this out. Jamar, if he held out, he would have to come back by week 10, I think. So, or somewhere around there. He could sit out multiple games, but if he didn't come back by week 10, he would basically lose credit for this season entirely, and his contract would just keep extending out by another year. So he has to come back to make this year count for his contract so he gets paid at all. He would lose out on the game checks, but he might say, I've made enough, or it's worth my while to miss out on these game checks because I want to get paid, $35 million a year, let's say. Well, if he's only making 4.8 this year, in theory, he could make it up if he just gets a better contract and he can just sit out. So whatever. I know people say, well, this is the year that the Bengals could go to the Super Bowl. They got to get a ring. Isn't that what they play for? It shouldn't be about the money. It's about the ring. Like, nobody else acts like that for their real job. The guy who's driving the trash truck that come pick up the trash down the street, he's not getting up in the morning thinking, at the end of the year, I'm going to win a ring for best waste management employee or whatever. Like, people are just doing this for the paycheck. NFL players are no different. They don't care about, I mean, some of them maybe they want to win the Super Bowl and be great, but most of them are there for a paycheck, just like everybody else. So this whole concept of they should sacrifice their paycheck for the chance to win the Super Bowl, that's just complete nonsense. And when you think about somebody like Justin Jefferson, who played out last year on his rookie contract, didn't get anything. He tore his hamstring halfway through the season, had to miss the rest of the year, and that was unfortunate. And it was good that the Vikings, held up their end of the bargain and still signed him to a long-term contract. It wasn't going to be a serious long-term injury, but still, you never want to be in a situation where you're lowering your value or, as a player, lessening your bargaining leverage with the team. And some people would say, well, what about the team? Like, if the player gets hurt, is the player going to pay the money back to the team? Well, no, of course not. They're not going to give the money back. But the player is taking all the physical risk. Like, Mike Brown isn't risking his body out there for our entertainment. He's sitting up in the stands getting fat and rich, while he, pays the players to go out there. And I don't hear people complaining about, why do boxers get paid so much? They're going out there and punching each other in the face. Everybody has an agreement like, yeah, boxers should get paid prize money for prize fighting. Same thing goes for professional athletes. They're going out there and putting their bodies on the line for your entertainment. So I don't want to hear you complaining about they're getting paid too much. If you don't like it, don't watch. We'll see what happens with that situation. Like I said, Zach Taylor is doing the PR, HR response constantly, just repeating the same thing. Yep, all part of the plan. Jamar and I have great communication. Everything's going according to the plan. We feel great about the plan and where we're headed. Pretty much all he says. Nothing, no kind of answer. I don't expect to hear any news about this. If it starts to go into the season, we'll see. But for now, not concerned. And the thing is, there are other teams who have signed their players. So you hear this narrative over and over. I think it's just to cover the team that says, well, you can't pay everybody. And like we talked about, Mike Brown loves the analogies of there's not enough pie to go around for everybody. But the Bengals have like $20 million of pie sitting there uneaten that could be paid to Jamar Chase. So it's like, yeah, you could break off the pie or you could keep it for yourself. But people say, well, you can't pay everybody. And, you can't pay 2 wide receivers on the same team. Like, it's impossible. Well, actually, if you look at the Eagles, and they'll say, well, you can't play 2 wide receivers and Joe Burrow. I mean, that's crazy. What? But if you look at the Eagles, they signed Jalen Hurts, and they signed Devontae Smith, and they signed A.J. Brown, all to big long-term contracts. And look at the Dolphins. They just signed Tua, the quarterback, and they signed Tyreek Hill to an extension, and Jalen Waddle, quarterback and 2 wide receivers. So it's definitely possible if they wanted to. Nothing is impossible. You can do whatever you want. But there are teams, and people say, oh, Bengals don't have enough money. They couldn't afford it. Well, even teams that have tons of money, like the Cowboys and Jerry Jones down in Dallas, they've got 3 players looking for new contracts and are all at an impasse. Dak Prescott, the quarterback, CeeDee Lamb, their wide receiver, and Micah Parsons, their star pass rushing linebacker. They all want contracts. And the Cowboys are saying, hemming and hawing, we can't pay everybody. Same Mike Brown song and dance. So whether it's the Cowboys or the Bengals, owners can be cheap no matter how much money they have or how much perceived money or value that their franchise has. But let's get back to the depth chart a little bit here. So I talked about the offense earlier. We already know Jake Browning is going to be the backup quarterback. We're going to see him a lot in this preseason game. We're also going to see the defense, probably not that much, but the starting defense right now, Sam Hubbard, Sheldon Rankins, B.J. Hill, Trey Hendrickson up front, linebackers, Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt. Then in the secondary, Mike Hilton, Cam Taylor-Britt, DJ Turner, Geno Stone, and Von Bell. No surprises there. Looking at the backups, yeah, they do have Jay Tufele as the backup nose tackle, McKinley Jackson and Dominique Davis behind him. Camp Sample out, that's going to mean Miles Murphy and Cedric Johnson are going to have to step up. Jeff Gunter and Justin Blazek. I think I remember them signing him, but not a name that's really going to pop off the screen to you. They have, rookies, Chris Jenkins, the second-round pick. And then Dax Hill is second-string cornerback. He's not at safety anymore. They got Tyson Anderson, Jordan Battle. They've been hyping up Dejon Anthony a lot. He's been making, I think he had like 3 interceptions in training camp. And Josh Newton, the rookie out of TCU, he's been getting a lot of good feedback, I guess you could say, from the reporters. So it'll be interesting. The Bengals defense was pretty terrible last year. So on paper, it's mostly the same guys. I guess the biggest thing is the safeties are swapped out. Instead of Dax Hill and Nick Scott, they got Geno Stone and Von Bell. And everybody's talking about how, just night and day difference. The communication, so much different. It's like they act like Dax Hill was speaking Chinese back in the backfield last year. And now it's like, Von Bell is back. Way better. So we'll see. The linebackers and the people up front, they were all saying that communication was the thing that was not helping them last year. But I mean, I guess the Chiefs, 4th and 1, Jermaine Pratt, the communication had nothing to do with Patrick Mahomes just running straight through him and getting the first down. So nobody needed to communicate to Jermaine Pratt to tackle Patrick Mahomes. I don't want to hear anything about communication when we're missing tackles out here. But anyway, I'm super excited for this year. So special teams, we already mentioned the punting battle is down to 2 instead of 3. Brad Robbins lived to fight another day, but he was the draft pick last year, so they got to save face and keep him around for at least part of training camp since he was the draft pick. But Ryan Rico, hot on the heels. We'll have to see how they look in the game. If Ryan Rico is booming like 80-yard punts and Brad Robbins is shanking them out of bounds, I think we know which way this is going to go. Evan McPherson, obviously the kicker. They don't have a backup kicker, which you don't normally need a backup kicker, but if they had 3 punters, why not get a second kicker? But whatever. Cal Adamitis, long snapper. For the punt returner, they got Charlie Jones. For kickoff return, they got Travion Williams, Chase Brown, Chris Evans, Charlie Jones, Kwame Lassiter. So we'll have to see. That was the interesting thing that we saw in the Hall of Fame game. The kickoff and the new rules. They weren't really showing exactly how it's going to look, but it was a close approximation to it of the new kickoff rules. The defenders are going to be lined up further down the field, closer to the blockers, not as much like high impact, running 50 yards straight into each other and let's break our necks, but more close space, more returns. The biggest thing is, at least it's something to watch, because in the past, however many years it's been, the kickers are kicking it so far, they just kick it out of the end zone. And it's a completely dead play, or it was a completely dead play. That's boring. Like, nobody wants to watch. Nothing happened. Nobody hit each other. And it was weird because Evan McPherson made a comment. They were asking him, what does he think about the new kickoff rules? He was like, it's weird. It doesn't really feel like football to me. But I don't know what that means, because apparently that's why kickers are weird, because it's in Evan McPherson's mind, football means kicking the ball out of bounds where nobody touches anybody, nobody hits each other, and then they just blow the whistle. That's not football to me or anybody else, so that's why they changed the rules. So football is where people actually touch each other, hit each other, tackle each other, and run with the football, not just kick it out of bounds. But that'll be an adjustment for the players. It'll be an adjustment for the fans. I don't have any problem with it. Like I said, I welcome the change because it'll at least be something to watch. That's the whole point of watching these games, is something interesting to see. Some of the other interesting things we saw this week were more interviews with the team reporters, like Dan Hoard and Dave Lapham did a bunch of interviews with players, and they kind of cycled through all the players. It was interesting. It was one of the first sit-down interviews that they have ever done with Joe Burrow, as far as I can remember. I don't remember a lot of Joe Burrow interviews, even though they're the team reporters. Like, Joe Burrow doesn't do interviews, period, for whatever reason, but he talked about how he wanted to open up more and show more of his personality, build his brand more, all that kind of stuff. It's weird because this is the 5th year that Joe Burrow has been in the league. It's not like it's year 2 or year 3 where it's like, I'm coming out of my shells. Like, it took him until year 5 to really start to open up. But I think part of it was he signed his contract last season. And so if he had done any interview at any point last season, it would have been all about the contract. When are you going to sign the contract extension? How much money do you want? Blah, blah, blah. Are you going to hold out? And it was just unending questions about his contract. Now that he's got that out of the way, there's no more questions about the contract. He's signed here for multiple seasons. Nobody has to worry about that. So now it's just about playing football. A lot of the questions are about his injury status, which he doesn't necessarily want to talk about either, but he's finally healthy. I think this season is going to be a good season for Joe Burrow and the Bengals. It's all going to kick off this Saturday, the 10th, August 10th, at Paycor Stadium against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I don't anticipate that we're going to see Baker Mayfield playing in this game, which is good because, as we all know, Baker Mayfield is like the Bengals' kryptonite. So hopefully he doesn't play. But if you want to watch that game, it's going to be on Fox 19. They switched it up, the TV station that was like the normal TV station. I forget which it was, but it's Fox 19 now. It's also going to be on the radio. It's going to be syndicated. And they're going to have the Bengals preseason announce crew back. So they're going to have Mike Watts on play-by-play, Anthony Munoz as the color analyst, and Marissa Contepelli as the sideline reporter. So maybe Marissa will get some interviews with the players while that's going on. Hopefully the game is interesting. Again, the Bengals always roll out just a vanilla game plan. And that's the other thing about the kickoff rules was everything was very vanilla in terms of they just kick the ball straight down the middle. Nothing in terms of squib kicks or kicks to the side or anything strategically placing the football. They were maybe had an agreement like, hey, we're just going to kick it, pop it up in the air so that you can return it and see what the returns look like. Because they had a lot of returns and most of them ended at like the 27, 26 yard line. They didn't get very far, but the kicking team didn't pin them very deep. It's interesting that if they kicked it through the end zone, it would come to the 30-yard line, and most of the returns are getting to the 27. It's only a 3-yard difference to just take the touchback. Some teams might opt to just always go with the touchback unless they change the rules. They were thinking about having a touchback be the 35-yard line, but for whatever reason, they decided not to do that. So we'll have to see. They may kind of tweak the rules next year. We'll have to see how this year goes. But at least, hopefully, they get some more returns, something more interesting to watch. But I hope this game is interesting to watch. We'll come back after it and give some thoughts and analysis of what we see in this preseason game, who stood out and who had some work to do to make this team. So I'm pumped up for the season to start. I hope you are too. Until next time, I'm going to leave you with a hooday and stay hungry for more Bengal Bites.